two common questions I get are, one, what does insurance want to see in my notes? And two, I don't work with insurance, so it's the bare minimum I can put in my progress notes. My answer to those questions is usually that it really isn't that big a difference doing documentation for an insurance client versus a private pay client, but reality is there are a few differences, so in this video, we're going to review them. Hi, I'm Dr. Maelisa McCaffrey, founder of the free private practice paperwork crash course, and today I'm going to outline the 4 big differences that I see between insurance and private pay documentation. Number 1 is that you don't have to provide a diagnosis if you aren't working with insurance. All insurance companies require that you give clients a diagnosis to show that they meet medical necessity and a need for therapy. Regardless of how you feel about this, that's the reality here in the United States. But if you're private pay, you don't have to worry about that. That means if your clients aren't submitting any super bills and insurance has nothing to do with paying for their therapy, you don't actually have to give them a diagnosis, and that doesn't need to be the basis for the therapy you're doing together. And this becomes especially relevant for clients maybe where they're dealing with grief, but they're not depressed, it's an actual grief episode, or there are other personal growth things that they want to work on or skills they want to obtain, but they really don't meet criteria for a mental health diagnosis. And we all know that someone doesn't need to meet criteria for a diagnosis to actually have a need. Another common example is working with couples and couples therapy, because insurance always views an individual client. So while you can bill insurance for couples therapy, it is in service of one person and their individual diagnosis. But if you're not worried about insurance, you can see the couple, and as most couple therapists are trained, you're viewing the couple together as a client, and so you don't have to worry about giving one or either of them a diagnosis. The second big difference is related, and that is that you can work on whatever goals you want to in therapy. You don't have to make sure that your goals are meeting some medical necessity requirement or that they're related back to a diagnosis. So in insurance documentation, the diagnosis is really the foundation of medical necessity, but then the treatment goals are also really, really important, and making sure that those two are connected is critical. If your client is private pay, again, they're not even submitting a super bill, so insurance is totally uninvolved. You don't have to worry about that. You still want to have goals, and most ethical requirements are that you have a treatment plan for your client, but you don't have to worry about how you write them out. You don't have to worry about putting them in SMART format, or even how many there are, or if they relate specifically to a diagnosis or some type of criteria. One of the most common examples here is anything related to personal growth. Lots of people enter therapy because they want to work on basic communication skills, or they want to explore dynamics from their family. But again, it might just be something they are invested in doing at the moment, regardless of whether or not they meet criteria for a diagnosis. So you can have goals around self-esteem and around feeling better, and that is totally fine if you're not worried about insurance ever doing some kind of audit or reviewing to make sure that you're looking at symptoms. The third big difference is that for your progress notes specifically, you will be documenting progress because all of us have that as an ethical requirement from our professional associations, but you don't have to worry about writing it in a specific way for insurance. Now, I talk more about how you write progress in a way that insurance wants to see in a different video, so we'll link that in the description below. But if you're not worried about that, then you can simply highlight whatever progress your client says that they've felt like they've made that week. You don't have to worry about them not making progress over a certain number of weeks. All of those are also normal with insurance requirements, but when insurance is involved, you want to be a little bit more aware of how often you're writing those things and make sure that that pattern isn't lasting too long. And with insurance, you're always highlighting both that the client is making progress, but also that they still need therapy. So it's this dance of highlighting both of those things at the same time, whereas with private pay, you can just focus on either or and whatever seems most relevant week by week. And the fourth big difference I see between insurance and private pay documentation is that the length of the session doesn't matter if you're private pay. Insurance has specific codes called CPT codes, and they're related to the different times or length of time that you took to conduct a session. And your payment, whether you are contracted with the insurance company or someone is submitting a super bill, the payment for that session is usually dependent on how long that session was. And things like intake sessions typically have another specific rate that's not necessarily related to time. And just to be complicated, insurance wants you to write down not only the session time, but the specific start and stop time of the session. So let's say you have a session scheduled for 3 p.m., but you start the session at 3:01. Whether that's because of you or the client, it doesn't matter. And then you finish the session at 3:52. Most of the time, none of us would care about that specific type of time frame, but insurance wants to see you actually write down the session was scheduled for 3, it started at 3:01, and it ended at 3:52, which means that the session lasted 51 minutes. All of those times need to be in a progress note when you're billing to insurance. And yes, it seems silly to me, and it seems overly specific, but it is something that is really important to them. So if you're private pay and you're not dealing with insurance, you don't need to worry about that. And that is really nice. That also means you don't have to worry about limits on time frame. So the code 90837 is the code that is currently used for sessions that are 53 minutes or longer. And you get typically one rate for that code. So whether the session was 53 minutes, 55 minutes, or an hour and 55 minutes, you may or may not get paid extra for additional time. There are other things related to that and other add-on codes you can put in there, but it's not a guarantee that you will always get extra money just because you saw someone for extra time. Also, because insurance typically doesn't like for you to plan to spend that extra time, they like to limit use of that code and probably won't approve it, or you'll get audited if you're using it really frequently for the same client. Whereas if you're private pay, you don't have to worry about that. I see this especially helpful for clinicians who work with clients who have a lot of trauma, where it can be really useful to schedule a session for 90 minutes, 60 minutes, but to give yourself and the client some extra time to process things, really dig into a difficult situation, and then give them time to regulate before you end the session. So those are the 4 big differences I see in documentation for private pay versus insurance clients. If you still have questions about the difference between an insurance and a private pay client or other aspects of documentation, check out my free private practice paperwork crash course. Like I said, it's free. And I do specifically go into things like medical necessity and what you might need to consider in your progress notes and your intakes for that. And I also talk about, in general, intakes, treatment plans, progress notes, and what you would want for your private practice, even if you're private pay. So click below in the description. We'll have a link right there and you can access it right away for free. In the meantime, happy writing.